In this episode, we confront one of the most disturbing tragedies to emerge from the Gauteng High Court, the case of Amber Lee Hughes, a preschool teacher convicted of the murder and assault of a 4-year-old stepdaughter, Nada-Jane Challita. This is not only the story of a life stolen, but also of a courtroom reckoning that forced South Africa to face an uncomfortable truth, that women too can stand in the dock for crimes that society struggles to imagine them committing. In this episode, we trace the legal merits that anchored the conviction, the psychological research that explains how cases like this are too often misunderstood, and the final day of Nada-Jane's life as reconstructed in court. We also follow Hughes' shifting defense from outright denial to partial confession, and close with the implications for how victims can be better protected, believed, and supported. This is a difficult story, told with care, about innocence betrayed and justice pursued. Before we dive into this gripping narrative, please take a moment to subscribe to our podcast. We'd also appreciate it if you followed our sister podcast, Unsolved Murders SA, where we delve into South Africa's most unsettling cold cases. If you enjoy our content and want to support independent journalism, please consider sending us a donation. A gift as small as a cup of coffee is highly appreciated. See the link in the description for details about how to make a donation. Your support helps us keep these stories alive, shedding light on the darkness that still grips our nation. Please take note, the views, opinions, and information expressed in this series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Swisherpost, its parent company Our Wish You Would Publications, and its partners. Some of the content featured in this series describes details of extreme violence, therefore, viewers' discretion is strongly advised. The case of Amber Lee Hughes sits amongst the most disturbing matters to pass through South Africa's courts in recent years, not only for the brutality of the crime, but also for the contradictions in the accused's own admissions. Hughes, a 25-year-old preschool teacher, was tried and convicted for the murder and assault of a 4-year-old stepdaughter, Nada-Jane Challita. In its judgment, the High Court in Johannesburg had to carefully weigh Hughes' eventual confession against her persistent denials, forensic medical findings, and the broader domestic context in which the child lived and died. At the heart of the verdict was Hughes' admission of the fatal act. She eventually acknowledged that she drowned Nada-Jane in the bathroom of her Glen Vista home on the 23rd of January 2023, first by sitting on the child in water, then by leaving her submerged as the tap continued to run. In her statement to the court, she described a series of suicide attempts that followed, but her acknowledgement of the drowning gave the court a direct route to convicting her of murder. The admission matched the state's pathology evidence and foreclosed any argument that death had been accidental. Where Hughes maintained denial was in relation to the sexual assault charge. She insisted that she was not responsible, forcing the court to turn to forensic science and opportunity. The state's case hinged on expert testimony. The forensic pathologist identified a fresh injury inflicted in the hours before Nada-Jane's death, consistent with penetration by a small object. The court found this evidence credible, and combined with the fact that Hughes alone had custody of the child in the narrow time window when the injury must have occurred, it concluded that she was responsible for the sexual assault despite her denial. The trial was marked by a shift in posture. Hughes initially pleaded not guilty to both charges, and the state presented its full case against her. Midway through proceedings, however, she changed course, filing a supplementary statement that admitted the drowning but rejected responsibility for the sexual assault. The court treated this as a partial confession, enough to establish intent and agency in the murder, but insufficient to absolve her of the second charge where the forensic evidence spoke louder than her words. The defense also introduced evidence of Hughes' mental health, noting a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. Yet Hughes herself told the court she was aware of her actions at the time and accepted responsibility for the child's death. This acknowledgement made it impossible for the defense to argue diminished capacity in relation to the murder, and the court ruled that her mental state did not lessen her criminal responsibility. In drawing its conclusions, the court did not rely on conjecture. It calibrated each allegation against the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. Where evidence was insufficient, the court said so explicitly. With the forensic timeline, injury analysis, and Hughes' exclusive custody converged, the court found the state had met its burden. The murder conviction rested on her own admissions. The sexual assault conviction rested on medical evidence and inference. Taken together, these formed a legally sound judgment resistant to appeal. The case is now in its pre-sentencing phase, postponed to October 2025. The court has called for reports in mitigation and aggravation, including a victim impact statement and expert assessments before determining Hughes' sentence. Whatever penalty is imposed, the judgment structure has already clarified its merits, that Hughes herself admitted to drowning Nada-Jane, that forensic medicine placed her in exclusive position to cause the child's final injuries, and that no defense of accident or incapacity survived the court's scrutiny. The conviction of Amber Lee Hughes for the murder and assault of a 4-year-old stepdaughter is not only a tragedy but also a rare example of female perpetrated child abuse reaching the courts. This feature of the case sets it apart because public imagination often frames perpetrators of such crimes as male. When women appear as offenders, society struggles to reconcile the reality with its expectations of women as caregivers, nurturers, and protectors. The research contained in Facing the Unthinkable, Women Who Sexually Abuse Children, addresses this blind spot directly. It shows that cases involving female perpetrators are chronically underacknowledged, often misinterpreted, and regularly dismissed until forensic evidence makes denial impossible. This is exactly the psychological terrain in which the Hughes matter sits. She was a teacher by profession, a role built on trust, and a stepmother, both positions that placed her in direct caregiving responsibility. Yet, it was within this framework of trust that the child was assaulted and killed. Studies reflected in the research stress that women who commit acts of assault against children frequently operate under a veil of invisibility. Their behavior is masked by social norms that cast women as incapable of such harm. In practice, this means they are less likely to be suspected, less likely to be reported, and often shielded by the disbelief of others. The research highlights a pattern of denial and rationalization. Many women offenders insist that what occurred was either accidental, misunderstood, or beyond their conscious awareness. This is mirrored in Hughes' own courtroom stance. Even as she confessed to the murder, she continued to deny the sexual assault, in the face of medical evidence showing a fresh injury consistent with penetration shortly before death. Her selective admission, accepting responsibility for drowning Nada-Jane but rejecting the forensic record of injury, reflects what experts identify as a coping strategy common amongst women offenders. It allows the individual to retain partial control over the narrative, admitting what cannot be denied while rejecting what strikes most forcefully at identity and self-concept. The research further observes that women who offend against children often do so within context of complex personal relationships. In many cases, children become objects of resentment, displacement, or jealousy, particularly when a woman perceives the child as competing for affection or attention. In Hughes' case, child testimony painted a volatile picture of her relationship with Nada-Jane's father. Text messages revealed arguments on the day of the child's death, and witnesses described Hughes as having displayed hostility towards the child in the past. These factors align with psychological findings that female perpetrated abuse frequently emerges not in isolation but within dysfunctional adult relationships. The child becomes collateral in conflicts between adults, and violence against the child functions as an outlet for unresolved rage. Hughes told the Gauteng High Court she suffered from borderline personality disorder. While psychiatric diagnoses are significant in understanding mental health, the research emphasizes that most women who assault children are not psychotic or completely detached from reality. Instead, they often act in moments of emotional dysregulation but retain full awareness of their actions. This distinction proved critical in court. Hughes herself admitted that she was aware of her actions at the time of the drowning. The court interpreted this as an admission of criminal responsibility. The diagnosis of a personality disorder may have shaped her behavior, for example, heightened jealousy, volatility, or impulsivity, but it did not absolve her of intent. The research reinforces this view, cautioning against misusing psychological conditions as a blanket explanation for behavior that is deliberate and harmful. One of the strongest psychological insights relevant to Hughes' case is the way women offenders often attempt to manage their image even under intense scrutiny. According to the research, female perpetrators frequently present themselves as victims of circumstance, of partners, of mental illness to soften responsibility. Hughes' selective admissions echo this pattern. By conceding the murder but denying the sexual assault, she positioned herself simultaneously as guilty of a tragic act yet innocent of what the medical examiner found most disturbing. This duality gave her a narrative of partial accountability that matched the profile outlined in the research. Understanding these psychological patterns was essential for the court in Johannesburg because Hughes's denials could not be evaluated in a vacuum. The research shows that female offenders often cling to denial of sexual misconduct even when other wrongdoing is admitted, precisely because society sees such conduct as doubly unthinkable, unthinkable in its cruelty and unthinkable that a woman could be the source. This is why the court leaned heavily on forensic evidence. Only the pathology could break through the wall of denial, fixing the injury to a specific time window when Hughes alone was present with Nada-Jane. This case illustrates what the research warns. Female perpetrated child abuse is underreported, misunderstood, and mismanaged. The Hughes trial shows why a gender lens that assumes women cannot be offenders is dangerous. It blinds both investigators and communities to the possibility, delays justice, and risks silencing victims who do not fit the expected narrative. Nada-Jane's death and Hughes' conviction stand as a stark example of how these blind spots collapse when evidence forces them into the open. Yet the path there was marked by denial, deflection, and the court struggled to reconcile confession and rejection in the same accused. On the morning of the 23rd of January 2023, the Glen Vista home where 4-year-old Nada-Jane Challita lived with her father and his partner Amber Lee Hughes looked like any ordinary suburban dwelling. Yet within its walls, tensions were mounting. Court testimony later revealed that the adults' relationship was volatile, marked by jealousy, resentment, and conflict that often spilled over into their parenting of Nada-Jane. That morning, as her father left the house, the little girl was left solely in the care of Hughes. It was the last day of her life. Later testimony and Hughes' own admissions reconstructed what unfolded in the bathroom. Hughes described submerging the child, holding her down, and then leaving her unattended in a running bath. This was not a single rash moment. It was a sequence of deliberate acts. When the house fell silent, the final minutes of Nada-Jane's life played out behind a locked door, witnessed by no one but Hughes herself. Forensic experts filled in the gaps during trial. The pathologist's report described the cause of death as drowning. The same examination uncovered a fresh injury inflicted shortly before death, one that the court later ruled could only have occurred while the child was in Hughes' sole custody. The stark scientific finding established a grim truth. Nada-Jane had not only been killed, but also sexually assaulted. What followed the child's death was equally chilling. Hughes did not immediately call for help. Instead, she later told the court that she attempted suicide in the aftermath, a detail that prosecutors interpreted as an effort to recast herself as both perpetrator and victim. Paramedics eventually arrived to find the child beyond revival. Neighbors gathered on the street outside, bewildered and horrified at the sight of emergency vehicles in a neighborhood unaccustomed to such crime. Police investigators recorded the bathroom as a primary scene. A child's toys lay scattered in the house, ordinary reminders of a short life. Yet the images captured by detectives, a bath, a lifeless child, a distressed but evasive caregiver, would later become central exhibits in the trial. By the time the case reached the Gauteng High Court, the narrative was shaped by conflicting elements. Hughes' confessions, her denials, the scientific record, and the domestic context. The state argued that Hughes acted out of jealousy and resentment toward the child, particularly on a day when relationship tensions with her partner had boiled over. Hughes' eventual admission to drowning Nada-Jane closed the door on any defense of accident, leaving only the question of intent. The forensic pathologist's testimony on the sexual assault was decisive. The injury was recent, inflicted minutes to hours before death. Coupled with the fact that Hughes had exclusive custody of the child at the time, the court concluded that she was responsible. Even though Hughes continued to deny this charge, the evidence spoke louder than her words. In the courtroom, photographs of Nada-Jane were showed, not the clinical evidence alone, but images of her alive, a 4-year-old, bright-eyed, wearing the colors of childhood. The dissonance between those images and the forensic reports underscored the horror of what the court was asked to decide. She was a little girl whose life should have been filled with play and protection. Instead, her final moments were defined by betrayal at the hands of someone entrusted to care for her. For the family, the proceedings offered little closure. Nada-Jane's mother, her relatives, and her father were left to grapple with the knowledge that the person who ended her life was not an outsider, but a woman welcomed into their home. The court proceedings stretched across months, revisiting in clinical detail what had unfolded in a matter of minutes. Each hearing repeated the unbearable fact: a child was gone, her potential erased, and her name now fixed in legal records as the center of a case no community ever wishes to endure. The courtroom journey of Amber Lee Hughes was marked by contradiction, strategy, and eventual collapse under the weight of evidence. From the moment she entered a not guilty plea in 2023 to the day in August 2025 when she was convicted of murder and sexual assault, The case revealed how denial, confession, and forensic truth can intersect in ways that define a verdict. At the outset, Hughes denied everything. She pleaded not guilty to both charges, forcing the prosecution to mount a full case. This meant the state had to call witnesses, introduce forensic reports, and reconstruct the Glen Vista tragedy without cooperation from the accused. During this stage, Hughes's defense strategy was straightforward: deny involvement, cast doubt on causation, and hope that forensic timing could be challenged. For months, this posture shaped the trial. Cross-examinations targeted the reliability of the forensic pathologist, pressing on whether injuries could have occurred earlier or by some means or other than deliberate sexual assault. Defense counsel worked to separate the drowning from intent, suggesting that even if death occurred under Hughes's watch, it did not meet the threshold of murder. But by mid-2025, Hughes's stance began to shift. Her legal team changed, and with new representation came a startling adjustment. Hughes filed supplementary admissions. For the first time, she confessed to drowning Nada-Jane, admitting that she had held her stepdaughter underwater and left her submerged in a running bath. This admission transformed the case. It undercut months of denial, aligned with the state's cause of death evidence, and eliminated any credible defense of accident. The Gauteng High Court now had the accused's own words confirming what pathology had already shown. On the charge of murder, the confession was decisive. Yet even in this moment of reckoning, Hughes drew a line. She admitted to the killing, but she continued to deny the sexual assault, rejecting responsibility despite the forensic pathologist's testimony that a fresh injury had been inflicted within hours of death. The selective admission created a strange courtroom reality. Hughes was both a confessor and a denier, guilty and innocent, depending on the lens through which each charge was viewed. The court could not allow Hughes's partial confession to obscure the facts. On the murder count, her words were damning. She admitted not only to drowning the child, but to acting with awareness of her conduct. This satisfied the legal requirements for intentional murder. The claim of borderline personality disorder, raised by Hughes as part of her defense, was undermined by her own acknowledgement of responsibility and awareness. Mental health issues may have shaped her emotional volatility, but they did not absolve her of intent. On the sexual assault count, the court turned to science. It weighed the forensic expert's testimony carefully, examining the injury's characteristics and timing. The evidence fixed the harm to a period when Hughes alone had custody of the child. No alternative explanation was plausible. Against this, Hughes's denial was unsustainable. The court ruled that she was responsible, even though she refused to admit it. On the 27th of August 2025, the Gauteng High Court convicted Hughes of both murder and sexual assault. The judge underscored that the conviction rested on two pillars: her own confession to the drowning and the forensic evidence that established her sole opportunity to inflict the injury. Together, they satisfied the court beyond reasonable doubt. Sentencing did not follow immediately. The matter was postponed to October 2025 for a pre-sentencing process. This stage would involve professional reports, mitigation from the defense, and aggravating submissions from the prosecution. The National Prosecuting Authority signaled its intent to submit a victim impact report, while Hughes's team indicated they would present psychological and social assessments in an effort to soften the penalty. Throughout the trial, Hughes's demeanor became a subject of public scrutiny. Early on, she appeared confident in her denials, presenting herself as a victim of misunderstanding. Later, as the admissions came, her image shifted to that of a woman cornered by her own words. Observers noted the tension between her identity as a preschool teacher, a caregiver by profession, and the charges she faced. The paradox of her role only deepened the courtroom atmosphere, where disbelief often mingled with outrage. By the time the verdict was read, Hughes's journey had come full circle. From outright denial to partial confession, to a double conviction that left little ambiguity about her responsibility for Nada-Jane's death. The trial of Amber Lee Hughes did not only determine her guilt for the murder and sexual assault of 4-year-old Nada-Jane, it also forced South Africa to confront a subject that is rarely acknowledged: that women too can be perpetrators of serious violence and abuse against children. This recognition has profound implications for how society protects its most vulnerable. Research shows that when women commit crimes of assault against children, they are less likely to be suspected, less likely to be reported, and often less likely to be believed. The assumption that caregiving roles are incompatible with violence blinds communities to the risk. In Hughes's case, her identity as a teacher and stepmother shielded her from suspicion until the forensic record exposed the truth. The implication is clear. Safeguarding cannot be filtered through gendered assumptions. Children require vigilance, regardless of whether their caregiver is male or female. The psychological research highlights recurrent patterns among female offenders. denial, partial admission, and rationalization, violence within the context of strained adult relationships where a child may be targeted as a focus of resentment or jealousy, use of positions of trust such as teachers or caregivers to gain access and opportunity. For parents, educators, and professionals, these patterns serve as warning signs. A child who becomes the target of anger during adult disputes or who shows sudden fear of a caregiver once trusted may be signaling distress. Taking such signs seriously and ensuring they are investigated is critical to prevention. The Hughes case demonstrated the decisive role of forensic medicine. Where denial persisted, science spoke clearly. The pathologist's testimony provided timing and characteristics of injury that the court could not ignore. This underscores the importance of strong forensic capacity in South Africa. When children cannot speak for themselves, it's often medical science that becomes their voice. Investment in forensic pathology, evidence handling, and timely processing is not just technical, it's an act of justice for victims. For every case that reaches a courtroom, many more remain hidden. Victims of child sexual assault often remain silent out of fear, shame, or lack of belief from those around them. This is why education is crucial. Children must be taught in age-appropriate ways to recognize unsafe behavior and to know that they can speak up. Adults, whether parents, teachers, neighbors, or professionals, must be trained to respond with seriousness, not dismissal. South Africa maintains resources such as Childline South Africa, which you can contact on 0800 055 555, a 24-hour toll-free helpline. The South African Police Service Family Violence, Child Protection and Sexual Offences units specialize in handling such cases. Non-governmental organizations and social workers are available to provide counseling and advocacy for children. Highlighting these resources is not a procedural afterthought. It's part of creating a culture where children are believed and supported. Nada-Jane's death stands as a solemn reminder of what is at stake. A little girl's life was cut short by the very person entrusted to care for her. The trial that followed exposed not only individual guilt, but also systemic blind spots. The ways in which gender stereotypes, volatile domestic relationships, and failures to recognize patterns of risk can combine into tragedy. For the court, the verdict established responsibility. For society, the challenge is broader, to ensure that children are never silenced by disbelief, and that every caregiver, regardless of gender or role, is held to the same standard of accountability. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our podcast and follow our sister show, Unsolved Murders SA, where we explore South Africa's most haunting cold cases. If our work resonates with you, consider supporting independent journalism by making a small donation. Even the value of a cup of coffee helps us continue bringing these stories to light. You'll find a link in the description with all the details. Your support ensures that the stories of victims, their families, and the communities they leave behind are never forgotten, and that we can keep shining a light into the darkest corners of our society. Please remember, the views and opinions shared in the series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Sister Post, its parent company Our Wisherwood Publications, or its partners. Some of the content featured in the series describes details of extreme violence. We urge our listeners to practice discretion and to prioritize their well-being while engaging with our content. Until the next episode, stay safe, stay aware, and thank you for helping us keep these stories alive.